following presentation contains both nonfiction and fictionalized accounts that may or may not have taken place in real-life situations. We had to state this for you idiots whom we know in advance are going to say we are mixing falsehood with truth. In 1959, a documentary was aired on national television that was titled The Hate That Hate Produced. The program was about black nationalism in America, practiced by a group called the Nation of Islam. It was produced by two television journalists named Mike Wallace and Louis Lomax for a program called Newsbeat on WNTA-TV, Channel 13 in New York City. It was Lomax, an African-American, who first found out through the grapevine about this group called the Nation of Islam, and it was Lomax who told Wallace about it. Wallace, wanting to know more about this group who preached separatism from whites, gained access to the group through Lomax and two white camera operators who began interviewing and filming members of the group and some of its events. The Hate That Hate Produced was aired on national television in 5 half-hour installments during the week of July 13th to the 17th in 1959. The documentary was so hot, it was aired again only days later. Here's some of the footage from the documentary that millions in America saw on their television sets.
13, we presented a 5-part series which we called The Hate That Hate Produced. A study of the rise of black racism, of a call for black supremacy among a small but growing segment of the American Negro population. Tonight, because of the considerable interest evoked by the serialized version, we are repeating this disturbing story with additional film sequences which we did not have time to use last week. These homegrown Negro American Muslims are the most powerful of the black supremacist groups. They now claim a membership of at least 250,000 Negroes. Their doctrine is being taught in 50 cities across the nation. Let no one underestimate the Muslims. They have their own parochial schools, like this one in Chicago, where Muslim children are taught to hate the white man. Even the clothes they wear are in sharp contrast to American dress, like these two Negro children going to school. Wherever they go, the Muslims withdraw from the life of the community. They have their own stores, supermarkets, barbershops, restaurants. Here you see a progressive, modern, air-conditioned Muslim department store on Chicago's South Side. Their story of hatred for the white man is carried in many Negro newspapers. Here you see their minister, Malcolm X, proudly displaying 5 of the biggest Negro papers in America. Papers published in Los Angeles, New York, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Newark. Negro politicians, regardless of their private beliefs, listen when the leaders of the black supremacist movement speak. Here you see Manhattan Borough President Hewlin Jack shaking hands with Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Muslims. And here is City Councilman Earl Brown addressing a Muslim rally. 4 or 5 times a year, the Muslims assemble in one of America's major cities to hear their leader, Elijah Muhammad. This coming Sunday afternoon, they will gather at New York's St. Nicholas Arena to hear him. But here, You see them arriving at Washington's Uline Arena for a meeting they held just 6 weeks ago. Every devout Muslim is eager to attend these meetings. For some time between now and 1970, and at just such a rally as this, the Muslim leader has intimated that he will give the call for the destruction of the white man. As you will see, every precaution is taken to protect their leader at these meetings. The Muslims, both men and women, submit themselves to a complete search before they finally enter the meeting hall. Some 10,000 persons attended the rally that you see here. All of them were searched. That's a search going on here. This process began 3 hours before the meeting started. And shortly, you will see Elijah Muhammad, founder and spiritual leader of the group. His flock is waiting for him now. And finally, here comes their spiritual leader, Elijah Muhammad. He's actually Elijah Poole of Hawkinsville, Georgia. During World War II, Muhammad was arrested and charged with sedition and draft dodging. The Department of Justice finally dropped the charge that he had advocated defeat of the white democracies and victory for the colored Japanese. But Muhammad and his followers did serve time in the federal penitentiary for refusing to register for the draft. Here you will hear Elijah Muhammad introduced by Minister Malcolm X, the Muslims' New York leader and ambassador at large for the movement. The good news that Minister X talks about here is the coming rise of the black man and the fall of the white man.
Everyone who is here today realizes that we are now living in the fulfillment of prophecy. Right. We have come to hear and to see the greatest and the wisest and most fearless black man in America today. Right. In the church, we used to sing the song, "Good news, the chariot is coming." Is that right or wrong? But what we must bear in mind, that what's good news to one person is bad news to another. While you sit here today, knowing that you have come to hear good news, you must realize in advance what's good news for you might be bad news for somebody else. Right. What's good news for the sheep might be bad news to the wolf.
The good news for the black man is that he is on the verge of recapturing his position as ruler of the universe. The bad news for the white man is that his long and wicked reign will shortly be over. And following this introduction, Elijah Muhammad, leader of the Muslims, speaks.
The Christian religion has failed you. Your leaders of that religion has failed. Right, dear Father. Now the government of America has failed you. You have no justice coming from no one. Right. You, as it is written, like sheep among wolves. Every wolf picking up at it. You want justice. You want freedom. You want equality. But get none.
Following this speech, which lasted some 2 hours, Newsbeat reporter Louis Lomax interviewed Elijah Muhammad, the spiritual leader of the Muslims.
Although you have said that the white race is doomed and that they are a race of devils, do you make any distinction? Are there any good white people? For example, suppose I were to ask you whom you think is the best white man. Is there any such thing?
I'll let the Bible answer that. He says, no, not one is good.
Now, if I have understood your teachings correctly, you teach that all of the members of Islam are God, and that one among you is supreme, and that that one is Allah. Now, have I understood you correctly?
That's right.
Now, you have on the other hand said that Allah has taught you that the devil is the white man, that
Yes.
the white man is a doomed race.
Yes.
Am I correct there?
Yes.
Now you have said, sir, that between now and approximately 1970, there should come a reawakening,
A general resurrection
of the American Negro,
That's right.
and that the extended time for the white man may well run out, and that will come and in terms of a war between God and the devil. This coming destruction of the white man, will there be any bloodshed involved in this, or will it be a complete mental thing?
According to the teachings of the prophets of old and of God himself, there will be plenty of bloodshed. Plenty of it.
Have you ever been accused, sir, of preaching hate?
Yes.
Do you think you are preaching hate?
No.
What are you preaching, sir?
Truth.
And if the truth is irritable or objectionable,
Classified as hate, then I cannot help that.
But of even more interest to New Yorkers is Malcolm X, the Muslims' New York minister. He is a remarkable man, a man who, by his own admission, was once a procurer and dope peddler. He served time for robbery in the Michigan and Massachusetts state penitentiaries. But now he's a changed man. He will not smoke or drink. He will not even eat in a restaurant that houses a tavern. He told Newsbeat that his life changed for him when the Muslim faith taught him no longer to be ashamed of being a black man. Reporter Louis Lomax asked Minister Malcolm X to further explain the Muslim teachings of Elijah Muhammad.
that in the same context that Mr. Elijah Muhammad teaches that his faith, that the Islamic faith is for the black man and that the black man is good, he also uses the Old Testament instance and he sets up the proposition there that this is the great battle between good and evil, and he uses the phrase devils.
Yeah.
And he uses it almost interchangeably and synonymous with snake. Now what does he mean there?
Well, number one, he teaches us that that never was a real serpent.
It was not a real serpent.
That went into the garden.
What was it?
But as you know, the Bible is written in symbols and parables, and this serpent or snake is a symbol that's used to hide the real identity of the one whom that actually was.
Well, who was it?
The white man.
I want to call your attention, Minister Malcolm, to one paragraph in this column. He says, and I quote him, "The only people born of Allah are the black nation, of whom the so-called American Negroes are descendants."
Yes.
Now, is this your standard teaching?
Yes. He teaches us that the black man by nature is divine.
Now, does this mean that the white man by nature is evil?
By nature, he is other than divine.
Well, now, does this mean that he's evil? Can he do good?
By nature, he is evil.
He cannot do good.
History is best qualified to reward all research, and we don't have any historic example where we have found that they collectively, as a people, have done good.
Minister Malcolm, you now in Chicago and in Detroit have universities of Islam, do you not?
Yes, sir, in Detroit and Chicago.
And you take your parishioners, you take children from the kindergarten ages, and you train them right through high school. Is
Yes,
this
sir.
true?
From the age of 4, I think it is, upward.
And you have a certified parochial school operating in Chicago?
In Chicago
and in Detroit.
And in Detroit.
And kids come to your school in lieu of going to what we would call regular day school?
Yes, sir, many.
What do you teach them there?
We teach them the same things that they would be taught ordinarily in school, minus the little black Sambo story and things that were taught to you and me when we were coming up to breed that inferiority complex in us.
Do you teach them what you've just said to me, that the white man is a symbol of evil?
You can go to any little Muslim child and ask him where's hell or who is the devil, and he wouldn't tell you that hell is down in the ground or that the devil is something invisible that you can't see. He'll tell you hell is right where he has been catching it, and he'll tell you the one who is responsible for him having received this hell, is the devil.
And he would say that this devil is the white man?
Yes.
Can a white man join your temple?
None have ever joined.
If one came up and attempted to join, would he be allowed to come in and be taught?
No, sir.
Why not?
Well, that's one of the reasons why most people think that Mr. Muhammad teaches hate. But if there is a rattlesnake in the field who has been biting your brothers and your sisters, and you go and tell them that that's a rattlesnake, and all of the harm that has ever come to them has come to them from that particular source, well, then that rattler will think that the warner is teaching hate. He'll go back and tell the other snakes that this man is teaching hate, this man is teaching hate, but it's not hate. It's just that when you study people who have been harmed and discover the source of their injury, the source of all of their defects, and you begin to point out that source, it's not that you hate the source, but your love for your people is so intense, so great, that you must let them know what is wrong with them, what is the cause of their ills. And this is one of the basic factors, I believe, involved when people think, or when the propaganda is put out that Mr. Muhammad teaches hate. He teaches black people to love each other. And our love for each other is so strong, we don't have any room left in our heart.
What do you think of the NAACP?
Islam is a natural religion, and it is difficult to find a black body with a white head and classify that body as something that's natural. Most organizations that represent the so-called Negro, usually we find when we study them that though they are supposed to be for us the leadership or the brain power or the political power or whatever power that runs it, usually it's the white man.
We have thus seen Muslim leaders in reflective moments and as they talk to members of their own flock. But what about their approach to non-Muslim Negroes? 3 months ago, Minister Malcolm X was invited to speak at a Harlem rally celebrating African Freedom Day. His audience was composed chiefly of Christian Negroes with a lively interest in African affairs. We've obtained film segments of that speech. The film was made under adverse circumstances, but you will be able to hear and understand Minister Malcolm X as he addresses a non-Muslim audience.
Who is his enemy? He'll say the Belgians. Ask the man in Kenya who is his enemy. He'll say the British. Ask the man in Morocco who is his enemy. He'll say the French. But the one thing that the French and the British and the Belgians all have in common, they're all from Europe. Is that right or wrong? How could so few white people rule so many black people? This is the thing you should want to know. How could so few? The white man today will tell you that thousands of years ago, the black man in Africa was living in palaces. The black man in Africa was wearing silk. The black man in Africa was cooking and seasoning his food. The black man in Africa had mastered the arts and the sciences. He knew the course of the stars in the universe before the man up in Europe knew that the earth wasn't flat. Is that right or wrong? Then if the black man in Africa had reached such a high state of civilization so long ago, at a time when the people of Europe were crawling on their all fours, what happened to make these people or enable these people to come out of the cave and come down into our civilization and take it over and hitch us to the plow? What happened? How did they do it? These are the things you should want to find out before you say hooray, hooray, hooray. Is that right or wrong?
Okay. I've just set the background for my short film here on YouTube. And you're probably wondering, why did I choose to call the title of this film Mike Wallace's Big Payback? Has this filmmaker lost his mind? Why did he choose that particular title? Let's move on, and you'll soon see.
And there you have it. Tragic and irrefutable evidence that a small but growing segment of the American Negro population is giving ear to a flagrant doctrine of black supremacy. I think that we stated our basic convictions about the matter when we entitled this program, The Hate That Hate Produced.
Mike Wallace was clearly biased against the Nation of Islam's philosophy and beliefs, and the show's aim was to get viewers to feel the same. The airing of the show, however, backfired because the Nation of Islam's membership immediately increased after the documentary was aired. But make no mistake about it, the relationship between Mike Wallace and Malcolm X would not end at the conclusion of the documentary. On June 8th of 1964, half a decade later, Mike Wallace and Malcolm X would again bump heads, and this time, Mike Wallace's confrontational style of interviewing would be on full display. And typical of Malcolm for the real man that he was issuing wolf tickets to the establishment, confident that if the Nation of Islam's Fruit of Islam soldiers had to roll up their sleeves and physically throw down, he believed that his brothers in the Fruit of Islam army had his back. Malcolm would soon find out that the support he would get was all in his mind.
So it's not a case of taking militant action against any police. It's a case of letting the police and anyone else who's involved know that we are human beings, we are men, and we will stand like men and defend ourselves like men.
One day while Malcolm was leaving his house on his way to Chicago to turn over a suitcase full of money to Elijah Muhammad, something on his television set caught his attention.
They say he ran away. Branded, marked with a coward's shame. What do you do when you're branded? Well, you fight for your name. He was innocent. Not a charge was true. But the world would never know. Branded, scorned as the one who ran. What do you do when you're branded and you know you're a man? Wherever you go for the rest of your life, you must prove you're a man.
What Malcolm saw on his television set would one day become prophetically parallel in his life.
Here is a bulletin from CBS News. In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting. More details just arrived. These details about the same as previously. President Kennedy shot today just as his motorcade left downtown Dallas. Mrs. Kennedy jumped up and grabbed Mr. Kennedy. She called, "Oh no," the motorcade sped on. United Press says that the wounds for President Kennedy perhaps could be fatal. Repeating, a bulletin from CBS News, President Kennedy has been shot by a would-be assassin in Dallas, Texas. Stay tuned to CBS News for further details.
And now, the Nation of Islam after talking all that talk about the white devils, are about to fool everyone with a switch in mid-air like Penn and Teller. The Nation of Islam, with all that white devil talk, was about to punk out on Malcolm. Malcolm was about to find out that the organization that he had joined had no militancy in it at all, and any semblance of militancy was all blown out of proportion. Elijah Muhammad was about to do something to Malcolm that Malcolm couldn't have dreamt of.
This statement is from Messenger Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Muslims in America. Minister Malcolm SHABAZZ, addressing a public meeting at Manhattan Center in New York City on Sunday, December the 1st, did not speak for the Muslims when he made comments on the death of the President, John F. Kennedy. He was speaking for himself and not Muslims in general. And Minister Malcolm has been suspended from public speaking for the time being. Mr. Muhammad's correct statement on hearing of the death of the President was as follows. We with the world are very shocked at the assassination of our President, and the nation still mourn the loss of our President. And he has said that it seems that every president who speaks out on behalf of the Negro has been assassinated, from Lincoln to President Kennedy.
Well, I'll be a monkey's uncle. And while you're at it, fuck a duck. They just backstabbed Brother Malcolm. Now, ain't that a kick in the head?
I think that was downright cold. Yeah, it was cold, man. The whole thing was foul, you know? The whole thing.
Malcolm X, you were involved in a controversy some months ago with your leader. Is that over?
Well, I've been silent for the past 90 days because of some statements I made concerning the President of the United States, which were distorted.
They were distorted?
And yes.
What did you say, Malcolm?
Well, I said the same thing that everybody says, that his assassination was the result of the climate of hate. But only I said the chickens came home to roost, and which means the same thing. Climate of hate means that this is the result of something. And when I said chickens coming home to roost, I said the same thing.
But you did not say that you were glad the president was killed.
No, that's what the press said. What would I look like saying that I'm glad the president was killed?
Malcolm, this is your first public statement in that 90-day period, is it not?
First time I opened up my mouth in 90 days. That's why I'm talking so fast and so hearty.
You feel, however, that we're making progress in this country and worldwide?
No. I will never say that progress is being made. If you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. The progress is healing the wound that the blow made. And they haven't even begun to pull the knife out, much less try and heal the wound. They won't even admit the knife is there.
But the real reason Malcolm X was suspended, the Nation of Islam's National Secretary, John Ali, didn't disclose to the public when he went on the air announcing to white America that Malcolm X was going to be punished. The real reason was to remove Malcolm from the position of power he held in the Nation of Islam. In fact, John Ali will soon play a major role in Malcolm's murder. And now, while Malcolm is still on his 90-day suspension, Malcolm is sent for. Malcolm's loyal friend, Charles 37X Morris, flies with Malcolm to Elijah's home. And both of them don't know what to expect. Like in those mafia movies. Usually when a person gets sent for, it's not a good thing. You either get upped or you get whacked. Malcolm knew in his heart that he hadn't done anything wrong. He couldn't figure out the sudden change that went from "Our freedom can't wait" to the Nation of Islam still mourns the death of President Kennedy, who Elijah Muhammad constantly referred to as a walking, talking, fire-breathing devil. Driven from the airport by taxi to Mr. Muhammad's home, Malcolm and Charles 37X cautiously approached the house. And of course, Mr. Muhammad didn't greet them right away. He deliberately made them wait. The 40-minute wait is what scared the two men even more. Their imaginations simultaneously started running wild as they waited, and the extraneous noises and subtle sounds of kitchen utensils being placed where they belong, glass plates and cups, knives, spoons, and forks, quietly and deliberately touching their destination, forced both men to interpret that maybe Mr. Muhammad wasn't going to dish out any more punishment. Maybe he was going to serve them a nice dinner fit for a king. But when the two men were called into the room where Mr. Muhammad was sitting in, wingtip chair diplomacy was not going to be on the agenda. The stale, cold, and distant look on Mr. Muhammad's face quickly told Malcolm that he was in big trouble. When Mr. Muhammad said to Malcolm, "I want you to go back and put out that fire that you started," there was no need for Malcolm to verbally respond. The physiognomy registered on Malcolm's face said it all. The acoustics in that room was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop and a mouse piss on cotton. Malcolm did the full 90 days, and his suspension still wasn't lifted. Malcolm knew his days in the Nation of Islam were over. What really hurt him is that he spent 12 years in the organization building up what he thought was a real army of black soldiers willing to physically fight black people's oppressors. Malcolm had found out that Elijah Muhammad was being paid a large amount of money from a rich white Texas tycoon in the oil industry to recruit black men into the Nation of Islam, only to handcuff them and make them passive and nonviolent towards their white oppressors. Malcolm knows that if black men will never ever stand up like real men and physically stop the hand of their white oppressors, African Americans will be the recipients of oppression until the end of time. Now he has to start from scratch and build a new organization to compensate for his 12-year loss in the Nation of Islam.
During the 90 days that I've been silent, I have come to the conclusion that I can best help spread the solution and the diagnosis that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad gives of the so-called Negro problem in this country by continuing to remain out of the Nation of Islam and working on my own without restriction in the way that I think I best know how.
When Mr. Muhammad stared at his television set hearing Malcolm's announcement, it came as no shock to him. In fact, he was glad that his loose cannon was leaving. If he had wanted Malcolm to stay, then he should have lifted the 90-day suspension. But even while Malcolm was on the 90-day suspension, orders were given to attach explosives to Malcolm's car. After that failed attempt, there would be many more attempts on Malcolm's life. While Malcolm was still on the 90-day suspension, J. Edgar Hoover would send 2 of his top agents to Malcolm's home to get Malcolm to sell out by taking money and squealing on the Nation of Islam by revealing their top secrets. When Malcolm told the 2 white FBI agents to basically kiss his ass, that's when they knew Malcolm was no sellout and he had to be destroyed. The international Western power structure at that point gave the Nation of Islam permission to murder Malcolm X. Malcolm never got a trial by the Nation of Islam to speak in his own behalf against the things that he was accused of. He never got a sit-down. He was instantly demoted and found guilty. The Nation of Islam broke their own rules that entitled everyone to a fair trial. Attempts on Malcolm's life are increasing.
As long as I represented the black Muslim movement as an example of morality, unity, and militancy, as long as I could do that, I represented it. It was when I realized that it could not be represented as that I came on and started working among the non-Muslim Negroes, as I announced in January, and I had no intention, or rather March, and I had no intention of ever even speaking on this. Had they left me alone, you still wouldn't know what really took place.
Malcolm has no choice but to go to America's #1 newsman, Mike Wallace. Malcolm must tell his story before the world on national television. If not, his goose will be cooked and his life won't be spared. Malcolm had no love for Mike Wallace, and Wallace had no love for Malcolm. For Malcolm, getting a sit-down with Wallace was his only option. The interview took place at Malcolm's home, located at 23-11 97th Street in East Elmhurst, Queens, New York. Malcolm expected Wallace to trip him up and make him look bad, but Malcolm's main concern was getting the story out and the interview being aired without being edited. That's all Malcolm was concerned with. The Muslims were foaming at the mouth, trying to assault Malcolm at every chance they got. Mike Wallace had a reputation as a news reporter, as the master interviewer. He was known for being as ferocious as a junkyard dog, known internationally for asking tough questions, known for dragging information out of people and getting them to say things they never wanted to say. The mere mention of the name Mike Wallace would cause people to break out in a cold sweat. Here's some brief excerpts from the Wallace-Malcolm X interview.
Are you not perhaps afraid of what might happen to you as a result of making these revelations?
Oh, yes. I probably am a dead man already.
What do you mean?
When you understand the makeup of the Muslim movement and the psychology of the Muslim movement, as long as if I myself, by having confidence in the leader of the Muslim movement, if someone came to me and I had no knowledge whatsoever of what had taken place and they told me what I'm saying, I would kill them myself. The only thing that would prevent me from killing someone who made a statement like this, they would have to be able to let me know that it's true. Now, if anyone had come to me other than Mr. Muhammad's son, I never would have believed it, even enough to look into it. But I had been around him so closely, I had seen indications of the reality of it, but my religious sincerity made me block it out of my mind.
Have you received threats on your life?
Oh, yes.
Commit murder?
Well, I couldn't say and wouldn't say. I can answer you like this.
Well, what now for Malcolm X? You announced when you left the black Muslims that you were organizing a politically oriented black nationalist party, but we've heard very little of that party, and here we are well along into June of an election year.
Yes, immediately I saw the need for a base. And so since I am a Muslim, and I knew that I could never stand up in public and represent Mr. Muhammad anymore, and at the same time I didn't at that time want to say why I couldn't represent him, I knew, as his son told me, Wallace Muhammad, that the only salvation for the Muslims, they would have to turn toward the Orthodox religion of Islam. And it was Mr. Muhammad's son, Wallace Muhammad, who encouraged me to make the pilgrimage to Mecca and get myself orientated into the knowledge of the Orthodox religion of Islam. And at the same time, since I was a nationalist, I had to have a better knowledge of what the attitude of Africans was toward our people in this country. So I made a tour through the African nations. After going into the Muslim world and into the African nations, finding what their attitude was toward the problem of the American Negro, I have now come back, and we are in the process of setting up an organization for that purpose.
One question before we go further with that. Has Wallace Muhammad left the black Muslims?
Wallace Muhammad was put out of the Muslim movement right along with me.
Now then, your black nationalist party.
It's not a black nationalist party.
Oh, what is it?
Our political, economic, and social philosophy is black nationalism.
How many members do you have?
At the present time, we have no members.
How many members do the Muslims have?
I have no idea.
You really don't?
But I do know that during the past 4 years, there has been more of a dropping away than there has been more decrease than increase. And most of those who have left have been the younger ones, the ones who want some action, and the ones who want to participate in the entire overall struggle of the black man in this country for his rights.
How many Muslims followed you out of the movement?
I have no idea.
How many did the Muslims have at their height?
I have no idea. When I watched your program years ago, I think you come pretty close to it when you said about 250,000. The following is not always an active, registered following. But
where does your financing come from now?
Right now, I have no financing. The only financing we have are the Muslims who are still with me.
Well, how do you support yourself, Malcolm?
Well, I'm unsupported.
Well, you seem to be fairly well fed and well.
Fortunately, while I was among the Muslims, I never lived beyond my means, and I have learned how to live within means. And I still have the clothes that that was provided for me at that time. I'm in the house that was provided for me, although we're in a court battle. They're trying to get it back. And I have made this statement to them concerning the house that they could have it if they would take me back, that they would permit me to come before the Muslim movement, the rank and file, and explain or defend myself against all of the charges that they've made against me. They could have the house. But they are going contrary to their own laws by standing up in the mosque and indicting me, but never giving me a chance to defend myself. And they say that no one can judge me but Mr. Muhammad. In this case, Mr. Muhammad can't sit as judge because he's involved in the case.
Elijah Muhammad says of the Muslims, we carry no arms, and we do not seek to win victory with arms. We do nothing to others that we would not have done unto us.
The two brothers were sent after me with revolvers by Joseph, the captain of the Fruit in New York. They were armed. When a Muslim is attacked, and you'll find this to be the pattern, when the Muslims were attacked in Monroe, Louisiana, Elijah Muhammad gave no signal to anybody across the nation to come to the defense of their brothers. When our brothers were attacked in Los Angeles, again, Elijah Muhammad gave no signal to anybody to come to the defense of those brothers. Never have the Muslims anywhere in the country gotten any kind of instruction from the national office or headquarters on how to defend themselves when they are attacked by outsiders. The only times the Muslims have ever been given any instructions to commit violence is when that violence is directed against a fellow Muslim.
As far as you are concerned, you will accept the fealty, if you will, of any Negro anywhere under any conditions.
You have to define fealty.
You want them to give you their loyalty.
Not me, their loyalty. I'm not seeking for the loyalty of any Negro, but I am seeking that for Negroes to learn how to be loyal to themselves. And when the Negro learns how to be loyal to himself, our problem is pretty well solved.
Cut just a second.
One brother encouraged to go out to my house and shut me up. And fortunately, it was a brother who was well capable of doing so, but it was a brother who was highly intelligent. He was academically equipped to think for himself. And what he was told to do didn't add up. And fortunately, he was the one who put out a feeler to me to find out what was wrong. And I opened his eyes. And then he opened the eyes of the same crew whose job it is to do this kind of work.
You mean he was going to kill you?
Oh, yes. One of them was, an attempt was made to get one of them to wire my car with an explosive. That one is with me right now.
Minister Malcolm, when you broke with Elijah Muhammad back in March, you said it was because the black Muslims were too narrowly sectarian and inhibited, and because Elijah Muhammad had become blindly jealous of you and the personal following that you had gathered.
I never said that Mr. Muhammad was jealous. Every statement that I made was designed to protect him and to protect his image. I said that his officials and his family there in Chicago were the ones who were jealous. And I only tried to protect his image because it was his image that enabled his followers to have such strong faith and exercise the moral discipline that they displayed. And as long as I thought that the Muslim movement represented a force that could reform the morals of the Negro community, I could represent it as such. But we had a strong law which dictated that any Muslim who became involved in any kind of sexual activity with anyone to whom they weren't married, they were brought before the Muslim community and humiliated and then isolated or sentenced out of the Muslim community for from 1 to 5 years. Well, in 1954, a teenage sister left Detroit and became one of Mr. Muhammad's personal secretaries. And there in the Chicago office, she became pregnant after being there for a year. And she was brought before the Muslim community and humiliated and isolated. And a year later, another secretary, this time one from Lansing, Michigan, came to Chicago. She also became pregnant. She was brought before the community and humiliated and isolated. And because the other person was never brought forth during this court session, it was concluded by all of Mr. Muhammad's followers that it was a non-Muslim who was the other party. Well, we grew so rapidly until that in 1957 or 58, the secretarial staff was expanded to, I think, 8 teenage sisters. In 1959, 6 of them disappeared. 2 of them reappeared in Philadelphia about 2 or 3 months later, and they were all right. The other 4 reappeared in 1960. All 4 of them had babies. All 4 of them had become involved with someone and become pregnant and had these children. So it was, from what I now know, when the 4 of them got back to Chicago and began to compare notes, they found that the same man had told all of them the same story and had made all of them pregnant, that the same man was the father of all 4 of their children and had also been the father of the children brought forth by the 2 secretaries who preceded them. Mm-hmm. So this story was kept among these sisters until 1962. 2 of them rebelled against the person who was responsible and began to tell the story all over the city of Chicago. It caused many of the Muslims in the Chicago mosque to leave and go back out in the street. They knew it, and I knew nothing about it until 1963 when Mr. Muhammad's son, who had been in prison, came out, and he had been a minister, and he was very religious and spiritual. And when he began to hear these rumors around Chicago, he went to one of the sisters, and the sister admitted to him that the rumor was true. And it was he who first told me about it. And when he told me about it, I wrote to Mr. Muhammad and told him about it, and he admitted that he had a knowledge of it, and that he'd given me a religious explanation that would fit into prophecy and all of that, so I was quiet. And it wasn't until October of 1963 that it came up again. And when it came up again, I realized that the same person who had made these other sisters pregnant was still busy doing the same thing. He hadn't stopped. 2 of the sisters had 2 children by the same man. And one of those 2 sisters was pregnant still, getting ready to have a 3rd child by the same man. So when it was known among the Chicago officials that I had a knowledge of this, they became very fearful of me. They became very antagonistic toward me, and they had to do something to diminish the authority that I had, for fear that if this became public knowledge, the followers would leave the Muslim movement and follow me. And it was at that time that they used the statement that I made against President Kennedy as a pretext to cut my authority, and some other things happened that finally produced the split, or forced the split. And when I made the split, the only reason that I didn't make this public knowledge was I knew the implications, and I felt that if the Muslims who were in the Nation of Islam knew it, that which enabled them to be so strongly religious and exercise moral discipline would be shattered, and it would cause all of them to go right back and start doing the things that they had been doing previously.
Who is the father of all of these various children whom you have enumerated?
The first one to tell me who the father was Wallace Muhammad, and he told me that the father was Elijah Muhammad himself. One of the sisters, he went to the home of one of the sisters, and when he walked in the door, she says, "I want to let you see something." and she showed him her child. She said, here's your brother, and your father is the father of this child. And then I questioned the sisters myself, because I was shook up. And they admitted to me that Elijah Muhammad was the father of their children. And I took it to him. And it was at that time he told me that he was Muhammad, the prophet, and that Muhammad had 9 wives. He also told me that he was David. He was the modern David, and that he was the modern Solomon, and that it was meant for him to fulfill today all of the things that they did back there.
And how many of these illegitimate children did he father with the sisters?
Well, he made 6 sisters pregnant. They all had children. 2 of those 6 had 2 children. One of those 2 is having a child right now. I am told that there is a 7th in any area where they are being attacked. They should, if they are intelligent, they should try and protect themselves, defend themselves.
Well, there was talk a month ago, you remember, of a group in Harlem called the Blood Brothers, who left the black Muslims when you did, and then later parted company with you, we are told, because the tactics that you espoused were too mild. What do you know of them, the Blood Brothers?
Well, I certainly wouldn't apologize for them. I think that the approach, if such a group as Blood Brothers exists...
Does it?
I say, I think all Negroes are blood brothers. Every Negro I know is my blood brother.
Oh, but Minister Malcolm, we're talking about a group said to number up to 400, probably more, who confess themselves to be anti-white as you are. They disbelieve in nonviolence as you do. One group among them is said to believe in violence, even in murder, almost for violence sake. Another group among them are said to believe in violence only for retribution, to strike back.
Well, if such a group as the Blood Brothers exists, it doesn't shock me. I would only be shocked at white people being shocked, because the conditions that prevail, Mike Wallace, are such that it's a miracle that such group hasn't formed a long time ago.
But do they exist, to your knowledge?
I think every Negro in Harlem is a blood brother, whether he admits it or not.
The group of them? Are you in touch with them?
All of my preaching is done to Negroes in general. I don't try and reach any special group. I try and reach all. And my gospel to them is black nationalism, political, economic, and social black nationalism.
You have called for self-defense units, rifle clubs,
oh, yes,
ready to execute on the spot those who threaten Negroes.
I don't think that I said that.
Yes, you did.
No, I don't think I said that.
All right.
I have called for rifle clubs, that I think Negroes should, in areas where the police, whether it be federal, state, or city, have proven their inability or their unwillingness to defend Negroes, the lives and the property of Negroes, then it's only intelligent and it's only right that Negroes protect themselves, and I have encouraged them to buy a rifle and a shotgun, which according to the Constitution is legal.
For what?
Not buy a pistol or something like that, but a rifle or a shotgun, which is constitutionally legal.
For what purpose?
So that at any time, anyone makes any effort whatsoever to brutalize them or attack them or endanger them, they should have something to defend themselves. And in a country that spends, I think, $50 billion a year for defense alone, I'm shocked that there's apprehension over Negroes trying to do something to defend themselves.
Well, who will determine when the Negro is endangered?
I think that if the government is concerned, instead of being so worried about what the Negro is going to do, the government should stop dragging its feet and take the initiative necessary to eliminate the injustices that frustrate Negroes and drive them into a method of defense such as this.
You've said, Minister Malcolm, you have to expect the Negroes to rise up sooner or later.
Oh, yes.
What does that mean?
Well, just the same thing that it meant in South Vietnam and these other places where you find oppressed people. Sooner or later, they rise up against the oppressor. When the Jews were being brutalized in Poland, there came a time when they couldn't take it anymore, and they fought back. They didn't have too much to fight with, but they fought back. And I think every oppressed people, no matter how meek and humble they are, after you drive them so far, they're going to strike back.
Well, does that mean that you expect to organize battalions or paramilitary units in various Negro ghettos around the country and establish this coming summer for violent action?
No, but I think that most Afro-Americans, so-called Negroes, have reached the point of no return. and are taking it upon themselves to be prepared if the necessity ever arrives where they will have to do something to defend themselves.
Minister Malcolm, you have suggested that there are all kinds of movements in Harlem growing that you and I don't know about?
Oh, yes. Frustration itself has been sufficient, all that was necessary to make Negroes realize the importance of banding together. And Negroes are banding together.
Banding together in what kind of movements?
Different kinds of movements, all kinds of movements, and they remain almost invisible. They remain almost unknown, but yet they are there. When I say invisible, I mean invisible in the sense that their existence is unknown, and no matter how much you try and track them down, you can't find them. And never try and find them through the Negro leaders. The Negro leaders are famous as apologists. If you recall, one of the most famous Negro leaders in 1959 was asked by you about the black Muslim movement. And he said he knew nothing about it. And the next moment you flashed a picture on the screen with him shaking hands with me. So if you will recall. So this is their policy. This is their attitude or their reaction. They never know what's going on in the Negro community.
And what form will the activities of these various so-called invisible movements take in Harlem this summer?
An example. Commissioner Murphy. Almost every statement that Commissioner Murphy makes would give you the impression that he's encouraging the police, rank-and-file policemen, that to take whatever method or measures necessary to hold the Negroes in check. He feeds the type of statistics to the white public to make them think that Harlem is a complete criminal area, that everyone is prone toward violence. This gives the police the impression that they can then go and brutalize the Negroes or suppress the Negroes or even frighten the Negroes. Whenever something happens, 20 police cars converge on one area. This doesn't frighten Negroes. So it means that someone is either misinforming Commissioner Murphy and making him use tactics this year that he would not use 4 years ago, or that the former policeman Kennedy would not use. And this force that is so visible in the Harlem community creates a spirit of resentment in every Negro. They think they're living in a police state, and they become hostile toward the policeman. They think that the policeman is there to be against them rather than to protect them. And these thoughts, these frustrations, these apprehensions automatically are sufficient to make these Negroes begin to form means and ways to protect themselves in case the police themselves get too far out of line.
And you know of the existence of these groups, clubs, organizations?
Well, when you walk through the streets of Harlem, you hear this comment and that comment, and you get the impression that everybody is ready.
They have arms?
I think Harlem has always been armed.
Do you look for violence in Harlem this summer?
Yes, I do look for violence. When you say Harlem, mind you, Harlem is New York City. Queens is Harlem. Brooklyn is Harlem. The Bronx is Harlem. Westchester is Harlem.
I mean, could you not become the leader of this kind of a group?
Which kind of a group?
A violent group.
It's not a case of becoming a leader of a violent group. I don't think any group, even that's ready, wants violence. It's a case of...
Is this not, Minister Malcolm, a call to action of sorts that you are raising here and now?
I don't have to raise a call to action. And this is what I'm trying to make white people see. They have lost their ability to be objective where the race problem is concerned, primarily because they know that no real meaningful results have come from the Negro struggle. And in defense of this, they always call it or label it violence.
You really believe that any meaningful result is going to come from violence?
It's not a case of violence. I think that, see, if you could get away from looking at it as violence, then you would be objective and see that actually all it is a tendency to react to what they are confronting. White people don't realize how frustrated Negroes have become.
I think they have come to understand the Negro's frustration, but they are also of the opinion that no good can possibly come from violence.
If they are of that opinion, Mike, if you think that the powder keg that's in your house is going to explode under certain conditions, either you have to remove the powder keg or remove the conditions. You can't stand there and label the powder keg as an enemy when you have the ability or have it within your power to change the condition, and it won't explode.
Do you know of any contingency plan for action?
No. I know of none. But I don't think if you go and study the history of oppressed people, I know of none. But I don't think if you go and study the history of oppressed people, usually their initial action is not a plan. Usually it's a reaction, and it's on the part of a few, and then everybody gets right on in with it. And I think you'll find that if Negroes ever have to resort to any kind of physical action to defend themselves, many white people will be on the side of Negroes. Many white people are fed up with what the Negroes suffered. And this is what I had to become aware of on my pilgrimage to Mecca. I could see then that there are many white people in this country who will side with the Negro in whatever he has to do to protect himself.
You have changed your attitude about the white man in the United States to some extent.
Well, I've broadened my scope. Travel broadens your scope. It gives you a wider understanding. And I have, in my many lectures on college campuses, seen many whites, even as a black Muslim, whose reaction to much of what I had to say showed me that they were genuinely concerned. Some weren't genuinely concerned, but many of them were. And this element is increasing.
But that's a considerable change of opinion in Malcolm X.
No, today I'm speaking for myself. Formerly I spoke for Elijah Muhammad. And everything I said was, Elijah Muhammad teaches us thus and so. I'm speaking now from what I think, from what I have seen, from what I have analyzed, and the conclusions that I have reached.
Then the white man is no longer the devil, and he is no longer bound to be evil.
The Holy Quran teaches us to judge a man by his conscious behavior, by his intention. And my reason for going to Mecca was to get a better understanding of the religion of Islam and what the Quran teaches. So I judge a man by his conscious behavior. I am not a racist. I don't subscribe to any of the tenets of racism.
Then there are good whites and good blacks and bad whites and blacks.
It's not a case of being good and bad, good or bad blacks and whites. It's a case of being good or bad human beings. His followers are violent against Negroes.
Against Negroes?
Yes, his followers will go out and attack another Negro, like they will attack me. Or they will brutalize a fellow Muslim who breaks the law. But you don't find those same followers going out and becoming involved in the Negro struggle in any way whatsoever. Now, the violence that he accuses me of is my tendency to want to participate in the struggle of the Negro at all levels. This is what he calls violence. I first received threats on my life in December. In December. No, not in December, in January. When it first became known that I had come back to New York and told the captain of the fruit in New York, who was my right-hand man formerly, and also the secretary of the New York Mosque and the minister in Boston. When it became known that I had told them, then an effort was made to shut me up.
I apologize to you viewers out there. I know I said I was only going to show you excerpts from the interview, but I just couldn't help myself. It was hard to delete and edit once Malcolm started talking. Any filmmaker who has edited a film knows exactly what I'm talking about. Once Malcolm starts talking, the man just puts you in a trance. My hand got stuck on the don't edit button. And important to this narrative, I wanted you to get a feel for what Mike Wallace's line of questioning towards Malcolm was all about. Did you hear the hostility? Why do whites pretend they don't know the predicament their forefathers have placed black people in? It's outright dishonest and mean-spirited. Mike Wallace did his best to prove that Malcolm X was the bad guy. Wallace actually went down in flames. Wallace's rep for getting people to say something to incriminate themselves came to an end when he went up against Malcolm X. When the footage of the interview was examined by the big suits up at CBS television studio, Mike Wallace had to explain why his high karate and verbal judo techniques had no impact on Malcolm. Wallace had no concern for Malcolm's safety. Wallace was just another member of the Fourth Estate and upholder of white supremacy. Up at the television studio, Wallace's colleagues were looking at him real funny. And now, to save his rep, it was time for the big payback. The interview Malcolm felt would save his life was never aired on national television. Malcolm was now a walking dead man. The interview was only aired after Malcolm X was murdered.
Mike Wallace, we had an interview with Mike Wallace, and they was going to give Malcolm the opportunity to tell the story in his way about these illegitimate children. This marriage. At 6 o'clock, it was supposed to air. It was supposed to come, but evidently something happened. It didn't come on. And Malcolm, let me use the term, was, as I was telling him, I call him a TV junkie. He was fighting the TV, looking for this story. And he wanted to know what happened. And Mike Wallace, or whosoever was talking, said the editor wouldn't allow it to be run. Now, if it have shown up later, I sent Mike Wallace a letter here not recently and asked him to give, trying to get him to give DeCarroll a chance to tell his side of the story in this book. And he haven't answered me up until this day. I seen him at Abyssinia, and he told me here what he done. I asked him why did he do certain things. He said, put his hand up like this. He told me, he said, he told me, I know Malcolm is your icon. He said, but there are certain things that I just can't do. That's just the way he put it to me.
The betrayal of Malcolm X came from many angles. Malcolm didn't expect Mike Wallace to side with him. Malcolm only wanted the world to hear his side of the story.
But everybody wants to have a hand in saying what they done for Malcolm, done for this and that and thing. But Malcolm, brother, believe me when I tell you, was betrayed by his own family, those who claim that he's my main man. He was betrayed.
There's a lot of ignorant people out here today who are running their mouths saying that Malcolm shouldn't have gone to the white media to tell his story. Do these ignorant people honestly believe that the Nation of Islam were going to give Malcolm a column or a 4-page spread in Muhammad Speaks to explain himself? Get real.
there are certain issues that have not been spoken about that are more essential to the purpose of this gathering.
Brother, some of us can't.
I listened to you. I listened to you when you spoke. I did not interrupt you, and I'm asking you for the same
please, man, you gotta, I know everybody.
Who's sharing the meeting? You are.
Everybody in this room.
This is exactly what Brother Malcolm would have wanted. You fighting each other.
Everybody in the room has important perspectives they want to make. We gotta give everybody a chance to speak.
This is exactly what Brother Malcolm would have wanted. You fighting each other.
Everybody in the room has important perspectives they want to make.
And I've been looking for him. I have a private detective getting all of the Reuben Francises in this country. And the Social Security Index does not list the Reuben Francises as having been dead. The Social Security Index does not list the Reuben Francises as having been dead.
The names of the assassins. You know, I have the names in my bag. The names of the assassins. You know, I have the names in my bag.
Reuben was a hero. And we should never meet and not thank God for him. Because if Reuben hadn't shot Thomas Hale, we wouldn't know jack snot about who killed Malcolm.